You are listening to I Am Refocused Radio with your host, Shamaya Reed. This show is designed to inspire you to live your purpose and regain your focus. And now, here's your host, Shamaya Reed.
Hey, welcome to I Am Refocused Radio. Once again, we are here, and just like any other time, we have a special guest today. Today, we're going to have a true honor talking to Tom Shanahan and all about his amazing book, The Right Thing to Do, The True Pioneers of College Football Integration in the 1960s. Today is going to be an actual history lesson. So I'm excited to learn more about this book and also about Tom as a person. So first and foremost, Tom, you have other books that you have written as well, but we'll be focused on this one today. How you doing, man?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on. This is an important history to get to a wider audience. People do not understand how much progress was made in the 1960s because the sports media back then avoided race. And there were people sticking their necks out, and they unjustly have not gotten the credit they deserve. And that's the point I try to make in my book.
When you look at the rich history, the coaches who were bold enough to even recruit, there's many stories, but there's a story of Coach Duffy Daughtry, who traveled to find the talent of players who were denied at their own local schools. And he was able to get them to Michigan State. And that's a story in itself. But kind of talk about the process of you gathering details and the historical facts.
Well, my first book was Ray of Light, Jimmy Raye, Duffy Daughtry, the integration of college football in the 1965-1966 Michigan State Spartans. And that focused on their two national championship teams with fully integrated rosters. But I began to realize later that Michigan State's story is much deeper than just those two seasons or just the 1960s, because Duffy Daughtry's first staff in 1954, when he was promoted to head coach, they included Dan Devine, who went to Arizona State, Missouri, and even Notre Dame in the 1970s, expanding black scholarship opportunities. Dan Devine's in the College Football Hall of Fame. Bob Devaney went to Wyoming, and he went to Nebraska, won back-to-back national titles, 71-72. Bill Yeoman, Bob's in the College Football Hall of Fame. Bill Yeoman desegregated Houston's program in 1964. Think about how bad things were in 1964, and he stuck his neck out. And he's in the College Football Hall of Fame. Sonny Grandelius went to Colorado. He's not in the College Football Hall of Fame, but Colorado has an amazing story about their 1961 team where they stood up to Jim Crow in Miami in the Orange Bowl, and the Miami and the Orange Bowl backed down. So anyways, what I began to realize is Duffy's fingerprints are coast to coast, not just Michigan State, because Devine was at Arizona State. And back in those days, there was an unwritten quota that schools, coaches, teams, they didn't want more than a half dozen black players. They didn't think that they could get along in the locker room, and they didn't think they would follow the leadership of black players. Duffy Daughtry ignored those quotas limiting scholarships. And Dan Devine followed that at Arizona State. He had his two black players on his 1958 team at Missouri. Nobody understands that. He was so far ahead of other schools in the South, and that was from his relationship with Duffy. And then Bob Devaney went to Wyoming, Nebraska. Let me back up to Dan Devine. Then he went to Notre Dame. He was there in 75. And you wouldn't think, well, by then, college football integration was a fait accompli by then, right? But Notre Dame was still in the single digits as far as black athletes. And the guy who really helped me on this research was Vegas Ferguson, who was, Dan Devine started in 75, but his first full year of recruiting was the 76 class with Vegas Ferguson. And Vegas always realized that the 10 black freshmen in his class was unusual for Notre Dame. And so he helped me with the research. So as I say, The fingerprints are coast to coast from those four men. Three others coaches associated with that era were Frank Cush, who Dan Devine brought with him to Arizona State. Frank continued, took over at Arizona State and followed the same Duffy blueprint. Chuck Fairbanks, Frank Cush was an All-American at Michigan State when Duffy coached. Chuck Fairbanks played at Michigan State when Duffy was there. He went to Oklahoma and he was promoted to head coach. At the time, Barry Switzer was an assistant coach, and Chuck made Barry Switzer his offensive coordinator. Barry Switzer told me that he and Chuck were of the same mindset. They were going to recruit as many black players and at any position they wanted. Because you have to understand, back then in the 60s, Oklahoma still only had a half dozen black players. So obviously that changed dramatically in the 60s, late 60s and into the 70s under Fairbanks and Barry Switzer. And then the last one from that era was Earl Edwards, who coached with Duffy at Michigan State under Biggie Munn. He went to North Carolina State and desegregated their program. So that's why I say coast to coast is Duffy Daugherty's influence so far ahead of any other coach. And the media does not understand this because they are so focused on the Bear Bryant myths from the 1970 USC-Alabama game.
When you look at the history and your career as a journalist, you have decades of experience with your career in sports journalism. How did that help you prepare with this project that is not just important for history to be told, but just from an educational point for sports?
Yeah. What happened with me was my parents were socially minded, socially progressive, and we moved to a small town in Michigan called Big Rapids. My dad was a professor at Ferris State University. So that was in that 65 and 66 season, I was just a kid, and I was immediately a Michigan State fan. And I was smart enough because of my family background to realize there was something different about the Michigan State team because they had so many black players. But more than anything else, they had a black quarterback. We still talk about black quarterbacks not getting fair chances. In 1966, there were only two, Jimmy Raye at Michigan State and then Stanford's Gene Washington. And Stanford switched him his junior year to wide receiver. So Jimmy Raye was really a pioneering figure as a black quarterback. And then Duffy hired him as a coach, and he was a pioneering figure as a black assistant coach. So as my career was winding down in the newspaper business, I kind of realized, this Underground Railroad story of Michigan State and Duffy Daugherty has never been properly told based on what I knew. And I found out I didn't know anything. The story is so much deeper than I thought once I dug into the research. So I connected with Jimmy Raye, and he was all for telling this story, along with his teammates, who also feel the Michigan State story has not been told properly and is unfairly in the shadow of Bear Bryant, along with the original black players at Southern schools who desegregated, like Warren McVeigh at Houston in 1964, Bob Grant at Wake Forest in 1964, Jerry Levias at SMU in 1965. These guys are the ones who cleared the road in the South, not Bear Bryant. Bear Bryant dragged his feet until 1970, and it's an absolute disgrace. It's a sports journalism failure. And I'll debate anybody, anytime, anywhere about this. It's a sports journalism failure that in the 1960s, the sports media avoided race. They did not document these milestones that Duffy Daugherty's teams were establishing, and as well as his assistant coaches as head coaches, as well as Jerry Levias, Warren McVeigh, and Bob Grant, and these other individuals who stood up to the KKK. These guys played through death threats. And you're going to tell me Bear Bryant waved his wand in 1970 and segregation is over? It's a disgrace, but the media continues to repeat that out of deference to the Bear Bryant legend without fact checking.
The importance of revisiting this part of history and to kind of put on display the facts that press was silent during these milestones that are being made. How important is it for these younger athletes to be taught this part of the history of sports? Because it's something that you don't hear about.
Yeah, they don't know it. Black and white kids alike, they don't understand how recent segregation was. That's when I do get a chance to speak at a school or in these interviews, I say segregation is recent history, not ancient. The kids today, they don't realize that in the 60s, if they grew up in the South, they weren't allowed to play for their major school, and they had to hope they could get a chance to go north. Michigan State was the true North Star for these kids. There's a guy named Garland Boyette who is from the Houston area, and he went to Northwestern because he worked at a hotel as a teenager for a Northwestern alumnus. And he hooked him up with Eric Parsons at Northwestern. And he got a scholarship, and he went to Northwestern. And Garland Boyette told me that black kids in the South knew there were only a half dozen spots for a black kid at the integrated schools in the North, not the South. It was segregated, of course. And so they knew there were only about a half dozen spots available to a black kid. And they hoped that they could be that one kid from the South. Well, Garland got his chance. He went to Northwestern. He felt isolated on the campus, as you know, it's a predominantly white campus. And he came back home and he played for Eddie Robinson at Grambling. He got drafted by the St. Louis Cardinals in 1962. He is the first black player to start at middle linebacker in 1962. Again, this wasn't reported by the media. So by the late 60s, the Kansas City Chiefs are in the Super Bowl, and everybody assumes that Willie McNair was the first black starting middle linebacker for the Chiefs. He wasn't. Garland Boyette was. So there's just so much history that has been paved, and kids need to understand the sacrifices these guys went through. Let me tell you a great story along that lines. Bob Grant, the first black player in the Atlantic Coast Conference was Darrell Hill at Maryland. But Darrell Hill was a senior transfer from Navy. He only played 1 year, and he had to put up with a lot of abuse. He was cheap-shotted. The fans were calling out the N-word, throwing stuff at him. But he only played 1 year, and Maryland did not continue to recruit black players for another 2-3 years. Wake Forest in 1964 was the first school from a major Southern conference to recruit black athletes out of high school. Bob Grant was one of them from Jacksonville, North Carolina. The other was Butch Henry from Greensboro, North Carolina. And Bob Grant was already committed to Michigan State. Duffy Doherty had gotten a commitment from him. And then one day his high school coach called him into the office and said, Bob, Wake Forest wants to desegregate. And I think this is where you should go. And Bob said, wait a minute, I'm going to Michigan State. I'm going to win a national title there. Because he was friends with Jimmy Raye. Jimmy Raye went up to Michigan State in 1964. And his high school coach, and remember, back in those days, there were no internet recruiting services. The most important person in a high school athlete's choice was his high school coach. And Bob's high school coach told him, said, look, you can go to Wake Forest and you can open doors for future black athletes. And so that's what he did. He had to put up with a lot of stuff while he was there, but he was an all-conference player. He was the first black player to make all-conference in the ACC. And then he was the first black player from a major Southern Conference school, Wake Forest, to be drafted in the NFL in 1968 by the Baltimore Colts. He was a second-round pick, and he played on the Colts Super Bowl teams. So the kids today have to understand these guys paid a stiff price to open doors, and we don't understand. We dismiss. We don't understand how hard it was back then. But that's what it took. Throughout American history with race relations, things go step by step, until we finally break through. And the civil rights movement is thought of as just a couple of years in the 60s. No, it started with Martin Luther King and the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955. And then we didn't have civil rights acts until 1964 and 1965. So you had the same progress in college football starting in the 50s with Michigan State's Rose Bowl teams, which I can explain, go in through the 60s when Michigan State gained so much attention for their national championship teams. A tipping point was the 1966 game of the century. Michigan State lined up 20 black players, 11 black starters, 2 black team captains, College Football Hall of Famers George Webster and Clinton Jones, and Jimmy Raye is the South's first black quarterback to win a national title. Notre Dame had 1 black player, Alan Page, and that was typical of integrated programs back then. They didn't have more than a half dozen. And the irony of that whole situation was Alan Page wanted to go to Michigan State, but he was from Canton Central Catholic, and his family wanted him to go to Notre Dame as a Catholic school. So that game was viewed by a record TV audience of 33 million. And again, so this was a tipping point. Another door was knocked down. More coaches began to abandon the unwritten quota. If you look at the timeline.
Once again, this is Focus Radio, talking to our guest today, Tom Shanahan, and all about his book, The Right Thing to Do: The True Pioneers of College Football Integration in 1960s. When you look, you mentioned civil rights, and when people think of the civil rights movement, we don't always hear about college sports. You hear about the typical stories, Jackie Robinson, baseball. But when you get reaction from people, how many people, if they're being honest, can say that they knew some history before reading your book?
Yeah, very little. And Jackie Robinson is a good point to bring up because, we talk so much about what a great pioneer he was, and he was, to break the color line in baseball in 1947. But it wasn't like that was the end of prejudice and racism in baseball. It was nobody else. Teams were very slow to sign black players. The Boston Red Sox were the last team to sign their first black player in 1959, 12 years later. Again, it's a slow process. And then Jackie Robinson, of course, put up with a lot of abuse those first couple of years. And part of his deal with Branch Rickey, the general manager, is he wouldn't respond, because if he did, and he was fighting with white players on the field, then people would say, see, black players and white players can't get along. So Jackie Robinson had to suffer a lot of abuse for the steps to take place until baseball finally was fully integrated. It was never an overnight story like Bear Bryant, Alabama, and USC fans want you to think about the 1970 USC-Alabama game. It's a myth that was made up 20 years after the game was played, and the only truth to it is the final score and the box score. That's it.
When people look at the facts of the book and the stories told from the perspective of both the coaches and the players who, like to your point, they paved the way for future black football players, what do you hope people can better understand about the time period, racial politics, and social change?
Yeah, well, that's why I appreciate you having me on, because when people do read my book, they're amazed on all the facts they did not know. Like I said, these things just were not reported in the 60s. It was a vacuum that the USC-Alabama game filled. So people are always surprised. They say they learned so much. The problem is, Bear Bryant's legend is so big that people are stuck on that myth. And I'm not a major writer. I'm not a best-selling author. My book isn't published by Simon & Schuster with a major recruiting promotion budget. So not enough people are hearing this story. And that's why I really appreciate you having me on. And I hope it attracts a lot of attention.
That's shocking to hear because when I looked over your website, the first thing I thought was like, wow, okay, this guy has been in the game for a while when it comes to writing and sports journalism. So to hear from you that is shocking because you would think something like this will be a massive flood of press, but they do say history kind of repeats itself. So what do you hope if someone listens to this, how can be the best way for schools and maybe former athletes to kind of push this history that needs to be learned and recognized? Yeah, just spread the story the best you can. I've reached out to names that you would recognize. I'm not going to call them out, although I probably should. And you'd be surprised that they don't respond. A national guy used to always tell me in emails, you got the story right. But when I talk about coming on his show, I never get an answer back. So what does that tell you? They just don't, everybody's afraid of Bear Bryant. They don't want to challenge that legend. And it's extremely disappointing. And like I said, I will debate anybody, anytime, anywhere on these facts. When you look at how players today, they have the opportunity for NIL deals, and I would say a lot of these opportunities that hopefully they appreciate, knowing if they don't know, they should know history, where it all began, that today it's a very different way of playing sports now because there's so much opportunities compared to just facts from your book. And I want to make that point because if you don't understand the privilege is to be in today's sports versus back then, what you hope young athletes can appreciate from that point of view.
Yeah, if we don't know where we've been, how can we know where we're going? That old expression. Yeah. And another good point along that line, it's not just players, but, going back to my first book, Ray of Light, both Bubba Smith and George Webster, college football Hall of Famers, who would be in the Pro Football Hall of Fame if it wasn't for injuries. All the old-time pro NFL writers say that. But I always say this, Bubba Smith is the most famous Michigan State football player. George Webster is the greatest. That's unquestioned among the players from those 65, 66 teams. But Jimmy Raye is the most socially significant. Not only was he a black quarterback when there were no black quarterbacks, but he has been a mentor to black coaches from when he first became an assistant at Michigan State in 1972, made a move to the NFL in 1977, and that includes Tony Dungy. Tony Dungy wrote the foreword for Ray of Light. Tony Dungy said at his Hall of Fame induction, he cited black coaches who helped bring him along as mentors, and one of the names he cited was Jimmy Raye. But in those days, this is another reason why Jimmy Raye isn't fully appreciated. When he was in his prime years to become a head coach, there were no black head coaches. So you can't grade him on that scale. He didn't get a fair chance. The great thing the Pro Football Hall of Fame has done in recent years, and this is in my book, The Right Thing to Do, is they started what's called the NFL Awards of Excellence. And this is for NFL people kind of behind the scenes. And one of those categories is assistant coaches. In 2022, Jimmy Raye was in the inaugural class. The next year was Sherman Lewis, who was also a Michigan State All-American from the South, third in the Heisman Trophy in 1963, hired him in 1969. Jimmy Raye, he didn't get a chance to be a head coach. You can't grade him on that scale. And the Pro Football Hall of Fame has done something good with this NFL Awards of Excellence. And then in the inaugural class was Jimmy Raye in 2022. And in the next year, 2023, was Sherman Lewis. Again, Duffy Daugherty's fingerprints. He had two black coaches, assistant coaches in 1972, Sherman Lewis and Jimmy Raye, before a lot of schools were just getting around to hiring their first black coach. So Duffy Daugherty's fingerprints extend to coaching at the Pro Football Hall of Fame, or we could say the NFL, because it's not an NFL award, it's a Pro Football Fame award. That's the impact Duffy Daugherty had on college football integration among players and coaches. There is no other figure close to him, but you won't hear that from the mainstream media. They think Bear Bryant waved a wand in 1970.
Once again, listen, before
Bear Bryant, the Bear Bryant, the same guy who dragged his feet until 1970, was desegregated in 1963.
Once again, listen, Refocus Radio, and talking to our special guest, Tom Shanahan. We've been talking about his book that you can get right now on his website, tomshanahan.report. It is the right thing to do. The true pioneers of college football integration in the 1960s is also available on Amazon, anywhere you can buy a book. Man, before we let you go, because time has been flying, I want to stress a point that I think this is a very great opportunity for maybe coaches around the country to introduce the players to this book so they can better understand that they didn't just wake up one day and got an opportunity to play for a university, but that these paths were made by players before them. So we hope maybe coaches maybe want to reach out to you and maybe have you travel and talk to their college students.
I'm always available for that. It's a great idea.
If those who are listening right now want to continue to support what you're doing, not just getting your book, but going to your website, what's some of the best ways they can do if you are in position in the future to travel and speak to universities concerning college students?
Yeah, my website is tomshanahan.report, and there's multiple stories on there. And at the end, you're able to email me. So you're able to send me an email that way. And then I'm on Twitter, Shanny4055. Send me a message that way. I'll be happy to respond to anything like that, because it's such an important story, and it's just lost in the shadows of a man who does not deserve any credit for college football integration. Bear Bryant said as late as 1967, the reason he didn't have any black players is he couldn't find any that were academically qualified. That's just a disgraceful statement to make, but he is celebrated as the true crusader over Duffy Daugherty and other guys. And it's just a shame. And the sports media, the modern sports media, has failed to understand this.
Once again, you can go get the book right now on Amazon. It's available there, or go directly to his website, tomshanahan.report. The right thing to do. Get your copy today. Like always, I want to say to you, thank you for your time.
Thanks for having me.